How does God's plan for us as believers give us full assurance of salvation? Today we're going to look at a key passage that speaks of God's eternal purposes for believers, including their past, present, and future. And the passage is Romans 8:28 through 30, and it's worth reading, so we'll read that before we begin our discussion. Verse 28, "And we know that all things work together for good to those who love God, to those who are called according to his purpose. For whom he foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son, that he might be the firstborn among many brethren. Moreover, whom he predestined, these he also called, and whom he called, these he also justified. And whom he justified, these he also glorified." Now, this passage is packed with language and theology that has generated various interpretations. And these three verses are most easily understood within the flow of the preceding context of verses 8 through 27, which is very important. Those verses speak of the restoration and return of creation to a glorious end, with believers ruling with Christ over all of creation. And the following context also is important in verses 31 through 36, which assure believers that nothing can prevent them from realizing God's destiny, or that destiny of being glorified with him. Now, in verses 28 through 30, these verses explain how God's eternal purpose for every believer guarantees their final destiny, with the encouragement of verse 28 explained by verses 29 and 30. The entire context focuses on the divine side of salvation. Let's begin with verse 28, which says, "And we know that all things work together for good to those who love God and to those who are the called according to his purpose." The "and" that begins the verse, the word "and," connects this verse to the context of the preceding verses, showing that all things refers to the sufferings that creation and believers endure until all creation is delivered from its bondage to corruption. You can see that in verses 18 through 27. Therefore, the good, the word good referred to, is God's ultimate restoration of creation under Jesus Christ. The personal sufferings of those who love God are subsumed in his greater purpose of freeing creation from its bondage. Verse 28 speaks of those in harmony with God's purpose to accomplish man's final freedom from the corruption of sin. How God accomplishes this purpose is explained in verses 29 through 30. It's observed that those verses begin with because, or the Greek word hati, which explains verse 28. Now, verse 29, let's read that. "For whom he foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son, that he might be the firstborn among many brethren." God's calling is preceded by his foreknowledge and predestining purposes, and followed by his justifying and glorifying intentions. Some interpret the word foreknew as God knew ahead of time who would believe, which caused him to choose them as his own. Now, that understanding makes one's choice to believe in Christ the ground of God's action, actually his reaction. This interpretation doesn't seem consistent with 2 Timothy 1:9, which says, "God saved us and called us with a holy calling, not according to our works, but according to his own purpose and grace, which was given to us in Christ Jesus before time began." You could also look at Ephesians chapter 1, verses 3 through 6 and verses 11 through 12. While the word foreknew, which is the Greek prognosko, often has the simple meaning of know beforehand or know in advance, as it does in 2 Peter 3:17, it could also indicate to choose beforehand, as in Romans 11:2, where we read that God was not expecting Israel to choose him, and he chose them to be his special people. We see the same thing in 1 Peter 1:20, where it's used of Christ being foreknown or foreordained before the foundation of the world. This kind of knowledge implies a special personal relationship. In the Bible, knowing can indicate cognitive knowledge, like in Acts 1:7 or 2 Corinthians 2:4, or an intimate personal knowledge, if you were to look at Matthew 1:25, Luke 1:34, John 1:48, verses that speak about knowing someone intimately, or even in a sexual way. Paul did not say God knew about those who are his. Rather, he said God knew them. Not about them, but knew them. In this context, God chose individuals not Christ or the church. Now, the word predestined is from the word proorizo, which means to determine beforehand. Here, the term does not refer to God's determination of those who would be saved, but to the ultimate purpose of those who are saved. He predestined all he knew to be conformed to the image of Christ. God's design is that all who are his will conform to their rightful position as co-heirs with the preeminent Christ, who is destined to be the firstborn among many brethren, or the preeminent precursor who believers will follow. Jesus is central to God's plan for believers and all of creation, and believers who endure sufferings will now inherit all things with Christ, according to chapter 8, verse 17 of Romans. And in the future, that will be in the future, liberated creation. It seems then, to be conformed to the image of Christ is not simply to be like him in character, but to share his destiny of ruling over all creation. And now, verse 30, which says, "Moreover, whom he predestined, these he also called, and whom he called, these he also justified, and whom he justified, these he also glorified." The word called, from the Greek kaleo, can refer to a simple invitation like it does in Matthew 22:3, 22:9, or Luke 14:7-8. But here it reflects the use in verse 28 of being chosen for a special purpose. And you can see that kind of use in 1 Corinthians 7:15, 17, 18, and 20, or Ephesians 4:1, or 1 Thessalonians 2:12, and other verses. This calling should not be interpreted as a general invitation to all people to come to Christ, because in the context it's only those who God purposed to share in Jesus' heirship. It suggests that God's special destiny for those he knows as his own. That it could not refer to a general universal invitation to salvation is also demonstrated by the fact that those called are the same ones who are also justified and glorified. Now, this verse explains how God's eternal plan affects our personal experience of eternal salvation. All those called, according to the text, are also justified, from the Greek word dikaiao, or declared righteous before God. You can see GraceNotes number 74 if you want to know more about that doctrine of justification. With the result that they are now in harmony with God and his purpose, which incorporates personal suffering into the hope of their final triumph. Romans 5:1-4 would be a good reference for that. And to be glorified does not refer simply to the believer's final transformation to Christ-likeness, but to be like Jesus Christ in that they share his glory in their eternal destiny. This is consistent with the context, especially verses 8-27. This word confirms the discussion of the believer's destiny when the whole creation will be delivered, quote, delivered from the bondage of corruption into the glorious liberty of the children of God. That's in verse 21. While our time-limited human perspective would assign these activities as past, like foreknowing and predestining, present, being called and justified, and future, being glorified, they are expressed here in the past tense because from God's timeless perspective, they are accomplished facts. The Greek aorist tense may be used simply as a statement of fact, but this context treats these facts as accomplished in the will of God, and thus the past tense makes sense. The use of the past tense, as seen in the word glorified, assures us of its certainty in the mind and will of God, though from our human perspective, it's future. This use of the past tense to refer to a future event is called a prolepsis, which means the assumption of a future act as if it is presently existing or accomplished. It implies certainty as if it was already accomplished in time because it is a reality in God's mind. You see, God is not limited to a linear perspective on time and events as we humans. He exists in one eternal now. He sees the beginning and the end as the same. He has always known, knows now, and will always know those who are his. Therefore, for God to know something makes it an eternal reality. I have a visual that may help show the difference between God's timeless perspective and our human limited perspective of salvation. You can see that clearly on our GraceNotes number 106. So the PDF has a helpful diagram which helps envision God's timeless perspective. So, what do we conclude? Romans 8:28 through 30 will continue to stimulate vigorous discussions and differing interpretations. And as always, context is key, which makes at least chapter 8, verses 8 through 27 and the following verses 31 through 36 extremely relevant to understanding this passage. Believers living in God's will find great comfort in Romans 8:28 through 30 because they have the assurance that God uses their sufferings toward their final destiny of freedom from corruption and ruling with Christ over all of creation. From the human perspective, God's plan and work began before human history. But from God's timeless perspective, it has always been an accomplished fact that included man's free will. In this synergy, which means cooperative work, God's sovereign will and man's free will work in congruence. They flow together, not in exclusion of one or the other. God has sovereignly purposed in his undeserved grace to accomplish our salvation through our free choice. And since our future rests in God's purpose, we can have full assurance of salvation. Well, I'm glad you joined us for this discussion of a very theological passage. You might just want to listen or to watch it again. I hope you find comfort and assurance in knowing that God has always had an eternal plan for you that cannot be interrupted. We thank God for this grace, and I thank God for you and appreciate you joining us. And I would appreciate you even more if you boosted this ministry with 5 stars, a comment, and a like. And be sure to subscribe so you don't miss any episodes. So, until next time, may you rest in God's grace and peace, and I'll see you later.